Hello and welcome. I am Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thank you for joining us for America's Agenda, Infrastructure. This is like one of my favorite topics that just doesn't go away. Our virtual event focusing on how to rebalance America's core assets to rebuild our national infrastructure, an effort that can create recurring returns and support for America's foundational businesses and communities, I should add. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Qualcomm and Maxar, for their support of today's program. Our aging physical infrastructure was a problem before the pandemic. If you recall, the American Society of Civil Engineers had awarded the country a D+ on infrastructure, and in my book, that's a high grade. But with everyone working, learning, and educating from home, there's added pressure on our existing digital infrastructure as well. As voters head to the polls, they're considering the various infrastructure needs of the country, but also yearning for answers on how to bring the economy and jobs back. During the pandemic, supply chains, manufacturing, product continuity, and availability were severely disrupted. Can revitalizing our industries to meet those challenges be a source of jobs to get the economy moving again? And as our reliance on the digital world increases, how can we bring our physical infrastructure into the future and embrace options for increased safety and security by connecting them to smart, data-informed systems? We're going to discuss all of this and much more with some of the smartest minds in the fields of infrastructure and policymaking. But before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at the Hill Events, all together, Hill Events, using the hashtag the Hill Infrastructure. We are broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. If you experience any trouble with the live stream, I'm going to laugh at this. Just refresh the page. That should be a quick fix. Otherwise, write our producers. Even though we haven't seen any significant movement on the infrastructure front in recent years, it's traditionally been an issue that's received bipartisan attention and support on Capitol Hill. My first guest is the chairwoman of the House Subcommittee on Highways and Transit, and she is feeling bullish about innovation in transportation. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton from Washington, D.C., where I live. Great to see you again, Congresswoman Norton. As I said in my introduction, I love this topic. It, for me, is like the number one kind of policy junkiedom. I would love to see some movement. Am I going to be happy soon, or am I going to be continually frustrated?
Well, you should be happy soon, because what would give our economy more of a kick than an infrastructure bill now? And you can do infrastructure without close quarters. One of the few kinds of work you can do now. Now, we have done our work. The Senate, the House Democrats. The Senate Republicans don't seem to want to spend any more money, even on the coronavirus, and certainly not on this bill. Now, this bill is denominated H.R. 2. That shows the priorities it had for us in the Senate. Every Republican in the House voted against our bill. They were largely opposed to the environmental sections. Yet we are in a time when everyone is focused on climate change, and it would be a fundamental error not to begin to take some steps on environmental issues that the transportation sector, which is the major sector promoting climate issues, if we did not take at least some actions on that issue.
Do you know, when I think about infrastructure myself and the kinds of things that you and your committee, your subcommittee are doing, it seems to me that you can bridge communities that haven't been bridged. You can bring in data and data infrastructure more completely into infrastructure. It looks like a lot of America's problems could in fact be addressed in part through smart infrastructure. And I think from hearing you in the past and talking to you in the past, I know you agree. What's holding it up? What are the barriers to really proceeding?
Well, this bill had a major priority. It's denominated H.R. 2. You can't get much bigger priority than that when you consider how many bills come forward. And also consider this, that almost no bills, certainly no major bills, are being passed this year because of the coronavirus. Yet this bill was passed by the House. So there's no question that this bill, which is usually a bipartisan bill, should have a very good chance of passing. Indeed, the Senate has even moved the Senate has two committees that
Right.
consider transportation. And one of them is far along on this bill. Nothing could be more bipartisan than transportation and infrastructure. There's just no partisanship to it. I think what's holding it up this year is that Republicans don't want to deal with the environmental issues that climate change raises and that are made inevitable before our very eyes, even as I speak.
You know, one of the folks I've had the privilege of talking to in the past is Anthony Fox. He was Secretary of Transportation during the Obama administration, former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, and he convinced me of something I hadn't been aware of, which is that a lot of highways, a lot of infrastructure had actually reinforced racial segregation, had reinforced a lot of the divisions in American society, and that we needed to rewire that. We need to pull it out. How much have you and your committee thought about how we take this moment where there's so much concern about racial injustice, economic inequality, and we're making transportation the core of trying to rewire some of those inequities?
Well, our committee deals with national roads, so that those roads do not nearly as much reflect the racial division you were talking about in our country, because they go across the country along the highway sector. It is true, though, that transportation has been a key to division in our country and where the roads go, but local roads are funded by local jurisdictions. And I think they are mainly responsible for the segregation you're speaking of.
Do you think that when you kind of look at the national highway roads, I mean, this is something that Lyndon Johnson used as a way to do it. When you look at toll roads, when you look at that kind of big question of, one of the questions I have is, as we have fewer and fewer cars that are paying for gas and there are more electric vehicles, et cetera, are we going to be able to find the new funding sources to kind of keep all this going? Say, look out 10, 15 years in a row. Are we going to have to recalibrate how we fund national infrastructure?
Well, we are certainly going to have to recalibrate it even today, and certainly as we use less gas and as we get into autonomous vehicles, we've got to reduce carbon pollution, even if people have doubts. I can't imagine where they come from about climate change. Nobody can have any doubts about carbon pollution or congestion. These autonomous vehicles are the real road to the future. They're going to reduce congestion. They're going to expand mobility. They're going to essentially change the way in which we travel. It's one of the things I am most excited about. And they're going to reduce injuries. The new cars will have automatic emergency braking, for example, on trucks and on school buses. That's the kind of innovation that takes us into a real 21st century era for transportation and infrastructure.
Well, thank you. Well, Congresswoman, we have been taking questions from the audience, and we've got a good one from Howard for you. So, Howard?
What about infrastructure needs for Amtrak, such as the Northeast Corridor between Washington, D.C. and New York City, where, for example, under the city of Baltimore, the tunnel was built in 20 years after the end of the Civil War? And what about the need for new tunneling under the Hudson River? Thank you.
Thank you. And I should note that's Howard Marks, who's the founder of Take Back Our Sidewalks and founder of the Ward 2 Better Government Association. So I think he's a local. But what about Amtrak?
Well, he'll be interested to know that Amtrak is in our HR 2 bill, expanded funding for Amtrak. Amtrak is more important than ever. Amtrak does not contribute to carbon pollution. So we have made that a major emphasis in HR 2.
Well, thank you. Well, Congressman Eleanor Holmes Norton, thank you for spending time with us today and launching our event on infrastructure. We look forward to seeing what happens with HR2 as things come back together after who knows what next week. I know everyone's very busy, including yourself right now. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Such a pleasure.
Over the past several months, the manufacturing industry has been part of the country's critical infrastructure by supporting healthcare workers, working on treatments, and producing much-needed personal protection equipment. That topic is not going to go away. Jay Timmons, President and CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers, is a leading advocate for the nearly 13 million men and women who make things in America. Jay, it's great to see you. Love your backdrop. You win. It's awesome to see you. Look, I mean, we've talked a lot about this manufacturing, about infrastructure in America, and about how investment in this area is one of the few things that kind of creates recurring returns after you make the deep investment for businesses, for families, for communities, et cetera. And so I'd love to hear, I mean, you've been at this for a long time, well before COVID, but I'd love to hear what you think our national priorities need to be.
Well, look, we need to ensure that once we come out of this, and we will come out of it, it's obviously been a lot longer than any of us would have wanted or expected. But when we come out of this, we got to make sure that we are still competitive as a nation. And for manufacturers, we worked really hard to get several policies enacted that would make us more competitive. So, for instance, comprehensive tax reform was a boost to manufacturing in the United States. It was a boost to the economy overall. Regulatory certainty was critical, something we'd been working for years. So we're very happy that we got those two very important priorities done. Now, there are a lot of other issues that we need to work on moving forward. Infrastructure, the focus here today, is clearly very, very important for not only manufacturing competitiveness, but for the competitiveness of our nation as a whole. Trade agreements is vital. You know, improving our relations with other countries around the world and being able to access those 95% of customers that live outside of our borders. Workforce development. We've had a horrible economic situation over the course of the last few months with such massive unemployment. But even with all of that, Steve, after we've lost 1.3 million jobs in manufacturing and only gained back half of those, we still, ironically, have 460,000 jobs that we can't fill in manufacturing. So workforce development and skills certification are so critical as well.
Jay, we're not on cable TV, so I think I can say this. I mean, you're a no BS kind of guy. We've known each other for a long time. And I think that one of the areas of concern I've had for a long time is what you just talked about, training, upskilling, what we do with our workforce, you know, to bring them in alignment. I know that there, at least right now, according to your data, almost 400,000 open jobs. There's a skills gap, et cetera, out there. The CEO of PricewaterhouseCoopers America, Tim Ryan, made a very big impression on me. He said, look, we're a huge company. We can go out whenever we need a new set of skill sets and just buy another company to do that. Or we can make the harder, but maybe the longer term investment in upskilling our own team from internal work, internal investment, and kind of do that. And I was impressed with that because I said, wow, maybe that's what we need to, maybe we've never upskilled Americans because it was too easy to acquire others for that. I'd just love to get your sense of what's real and what's fig leaf when it comes to talking about upskilling our workers, our citizens in America.
So I'm not sure that I could identify quite as succinctly as you have or Tim has about what the problem may have been, but the problem exists. And there is no question that all of us in every industry, every part of the economy can do better at upskilling and reskilling our own workforce, manufacturers included. And I'm really proud of so many manufacturers across this country who, over the course of the last several years, have really taken it upon themselves to do exactly that. But honestly, Steve, it's not enough. We have, right now in manufacturing, I mean, just think about this statistic. If nothing else changes, even with all of the economic calamity that we've experienced over the course of this year, we are still, by the year 2028, it's not that far away, we still are going to have to fill 4.6 million jobs in manufacturing. And all of our numbers, according to studies done by Deloitte and by our Manufacturing Institute, show that about 2.4 million of those simply won't be able to be filled because we can't find people with the right skills. That's why we've invested so heavily at the NAM in the work of the Manufacturing Institute. So they are on military bases, for instance, training, transitioning military personnel, those that are leaving the military service, on some basic manufacturing skill sets and certifications. That's why we have put a premium on reaching out to women. Only 27% of the manufacturing workforce is female, and obviously that's a huge gender gap for us. It's why we put a priority on comprehensive immigration reform, and why we don't support exclusionary policies that keep people out of our country, or even worse, keep 13 million people in the shadows, because those 13 million people who we can't hire probably have a lot of the skills that we could use to fill those empty jobs, make us more competitive, and increase the quality of life for all Americans.
I appreciate it. Jay, I wonder if you could give me a snapshot. You've got two big National Association of Manufacturing campaigns, maybe more, but the two that I know of is one's called an American Renewal Action Plan, and would love to just hear a slice of that. And then also in your call for about $1 trillion, which I argue is lowballing, and I'm probably a $2 trillion guy on infrastructure, but we'll settle for the trillion.
I'm with you, Steve, too, for sure.
Okay, you have a Building to Win program. So give us a snapshot of these two campaigns. Frame them as scaffolding for why they're important in this infrastructure discussion.
Yeah, and by the way, folks can get those at nam.org and they can see them. So the American Renewal Plan really has been focused around our response and our recovery to COVID and to what has happened to our economy. It really was focused over the course. We released several different tranches, if you will, of that plan over the course of the last several months. And the first few bills that passed Congress, the relief bills, we actually achieved about 6 of our priorities, and we were very pleased to see that. We were very pleased that manufacturers were literally at the table as many of these bills were being drafted. We're not so pleased that Congress is hung up right now on the latest round of COVID relief. So what we have achieved is we achieved, of course, the Main Street lending program to make sure that we had the appropriate liquidity for businesses, larger businesses that would pledge to hold on to their employees and not lay them off. We were very pleased to see the unemployment system that had some enhanced benefits early on to allow consumers to continue to spend. We were very pleased to see the PPP program that was put in place, especially that program for small and medium-sized manufacturers or small and medium-sized businesses that helped them to help ensure that they could access capital and not have to close their doors. Now, this latest round of relief negotiations has that one on hold, and it's really, frankly, quite frightening. We've got about 120,000 small businesses in this country, as you well know, that have already closed their doors permanently. We cannot afford, as a country, as a nation, the soul of our country cannot afford to see tens of thousands of more small businesses closing their doors permanently. The PPP program needs to be reauthorized. It's got enough money, but it statutorily couldn't lend anymore after a date in August, and funds have to be used by the end of December. We know this pandemic will not end by the end of the year. The last point I'd make in the renewal plan is one that has not been acted on, but I think either presidential candidate will be focused on it, and that is creating incentives. We hope they're incentives, not penalties, for businesses to invest more in the United States. That's what tax reform did for us in 2017. It really supercharged the economy, allowed us to hire about 250,000 manufacturing workers, invest more in America, raise wages and benefits. If we're going to focus on, some call it reshoring, I say investing the next dollar in America, that has to be driven by incentives. It has to be driven by incentives that actually entice companies to actually locate here and to manufacture here, especially when we're talking about supply chains. I had a big, let's just call it a discussion with somebody in the administration that was just incensed that we had to go to Kuala Lumpur. The NAM was really trying to help source and locate PPE during the biggest crisis point during the pandemic. We're going to get there again. but there was a big consternation about 60 million surgical gloves that I had to source out of Kuala Lumpur. Why don't we make those in the United States? I was asked. I said, well, because we don't grow rubber trees in the United States. And sometimes you actually have to manufacture where it makes the most sense economically, especially when you have raw input materials going into the product. And that's a prime example, which brings us, by the way, to infrastructure and our building to win proposal. We need to make sure that our ports and our inland waterways, our airports, and certainly our roads and bridges. I mean, gosh, we have 55,000 bridges in this country that are rated structurally deficient. We get a D+ rating from the American Society of Engineers. I mean, that's preposterous that in our country we should be experiencing that. And of course, infrastructure isn't just about asphalt. It's also about technology that is allowing us right now to have this conversation. So broadband, 5G, other technology that will actually propel us into the future. And I'm with you. Yeah. $1 trillion to me is a down payment. We're talking about a 10-year plan. No matter what we do, it's a 10-year plan. And you always get the back and forth. We've been advocating for this as manufacturers for several decades. Think about this, Steve. We've been arguing about $1 trillion for decades. And what have we just spent without batting an eye in the last 6 months? $3 trillion. $3 trillion. If we can do that in 6 months, I think we can do up to $2 trillion over 10 years if we simply put our nose to the grindstone and we stand behind those elected officials who are willing to take this on to help us improve our country for the future.
Jay, what you just shared from talking about, the budget and what we prioritized in the past and what we came in, what you've talked about, what it really is going to take to onshore, because I think there's a bit of naivete out there about that. These are all potential topics on their own, and I hope you'll come back and we can disaggregate, because it's very powerful what you said. So I want to thank you for that. Jay Timmons, President of the National Association of Manufacturers, thank you for your important thoughts today, your candid thoughts.
It's great to be here, and I never, ever refuse an invitation from the Hill or from Steve.
Thank you,
we'll see
Jay.
You again.
Thank you so much. COVID-19 has strained state transportation budgets. My next guest has introduced legislation that will create new construction jobs, provide a much-needed cash infusion, and ensure state highway projects continue as planned. Congressman Rodney Davis, the ranking member of the House Subcommittee on Highways and Transit. It's not like we haven't talked before, but the needle keeps moving on what we're talking about. Congressman Davis, great to see you. You just heard Jay Timmons of NAM kind of lay out a lot of the stress points that are out there, and I imagine you're aligned that we need to do stuff. But what I had found unusual about the on-ramp you're coming onto this is you're really worried about budgets now and the collapse of revenue to states. What's that picture look like?
Well, it looks tough. I mean, you got to remember, transportation dollars, either from the federal gas tax or state revenue sources, it's down because of the pandemic. And there's one thing I think we can do in Washington. That's to require our states to put less of a match up front so that they could take their local dollars and use them on more localized projects. If there's any time in our nation's history that the federal government ought to let the states spend their state dollars on non-federal projects and have 100% of our federal gas tax dollars go to projects in their state, it's now during the pandemic, which is why I introduced our Highway Relief Act.
And where does it stand now, Rod? Because, as Jay Timmons just pointed out to everyone, we've run very large deficits right now, but there's a big pandemic that's knocking everybody in the gut. Are you finding folks understanding your logic right now, or is it a tough slog?
Well, a couple things. First off, I'm going to have to apologize. I think my dog behind me has noticed a bird outside and is beginning to think about barking. So if you hear that, forgive me, Steve. But it's always good to follow my good friend Jay Timmons because he lays out the need for infrastructure investment so well every time I hear him talk. And the unfortunate aspect of where we are, because of the pandemic, because of the speaker instituting and implementing proxy voting, the opportunities for somebody like me, who's ranked the 13th most bipartisan member of the House, the opportunities for me to talk about good priorities like this and get it into maybe the next round of stimulus talks or COVID relief talks, or to put it on a standalone bill, has been diminished. And that's not good for how our country should govern. But I'm optimistic that once we get through this election, we come back in the lame duck session, that it's good common sense policies like this, that politics will frankly be pushed aside and this will be pushed through.
Let me ask you a question that it's sort of a meta question. It's sort of a, Steve Clemens, Rodney Davis, beer at the bar kind of question. When we talk about this, and I look at some of the stuff that you're dealing with, waterways, highways, railways, aviation systems, as big as they all are and as big as the demand that they represent, I also feel like we're on the edge of so many major technological revolutions, the Internet of Things, the way we process big data, sensors everywhere. And what I'm wondering is, as we think about this, are we siloed in the wrong ways? Are we able to have a conversation that begins to talk about waterways? I'm going to be interviewing Representative Sam Graves later, and he's interested in barges on the Missouri River. Well, barges on the Missouri River are also a function of data, connections, communications, and I'm just wondering if that permeates. Am I wrong that it's already that way when we discuss it, or do we have a problem in how we conceptualize and talk and think about infrastructure?
That's a great way to put it, Steve. I completely agree with you. We do have a problem. Everything's so siloed out. And the opportunity to break through those silos could have happened at the beginning of this administration, when if we could have come together in a bipartisan way to address a major infrastructure package similar to ones that Jay and you were discussing in the segment before, I think it could have broken those silos open. But instead, it's because of partisan politics and polarization that people are even more siloed off when it comes to infrastructure. And even those silos are becoming partisan, as we saw with the highway reauthorization becoming a partisan bill for the first time in my congressional career. And it's disappointing. But in the end, we have to have those who are interested in good public policy willing to come together and say, we'll take a large package or we'll do individual packages. But we've got to see progress. And this is where I got to give the administration some credit. You mentioned waterways. I represent the Illinois and Mississippi rivers, and our ability to get products out into the global marketplace depends upon our locks and dams. And it took this administration to finally invest in upgrading the locks and dams along the Illinois-Mississippi River. We heard a lot of talk about it in previous administrations, but no investment. Now, we've got an upgrade on LaGrange Lock and Dam. It's open. The Corps did a great job. Got to give them credit. Now let's move on to some others.
Rod, how do we compare against other big countries in the world, and does that matter? I was a few years back in Seattle, and they built the largest pontoon floating bridge in the world, replacing one before, between Bellevue and Washington. Microsoft was all over it, trying to help get it in. But what occurred to me is I learned that bridge took 15 years from conceptualization to when it opened up, and I was there, and $8 billion. And in China, it feels like they're doing one of those every 2 weeks. Is there?
It does.
I mean, I don't. Maybe, I'll admit to the viewers, I may have that wrong in terms of every 2 weeks. Let's say every 3 weeks. But my point is that a problem for this country that we seem to be going so slowly with the money, with the building, with the development, and I just don't get it.
I don't get it either, which is why, in my career, I've been leading the charge to reduce the regulatory environment. We can protect our environment. We can make sure that studies are done, but let's not stop progress. And that example you just gave in Seattle is a prime example of why we've introduced the One Federal Decision Act. It's a bill that would continue to reduce the regulatory burden and get us from what I consider the paperwork stages of projects to laying concrete, or in that case, building that bridge, getting to construction and investment so that our tax dollars go to something that the American taxpayers can see, rather than just sitting behind a desk or a computer screen doing paperwork and endless studies. That's got to change. And we've had bipartisan cooperation in the past in reducing the regulatory environment. Remember, a Corps of Engineers project, until Chairman Schuster and our Transportation Committee a few years ago passed a long-term WRDA bill, it took an average of 15 years to get from the design and engineering, the paperwork stage, to construction on any Corps project. That's unacceptable. Now, by law, we require those studies to be done in 3 years. But we can still do more, which is why the One Federal Decision Act needs to be passed.
Rod, the word infrastructure excites me, but most everyone else in the world, their eyes glaze over. Just want to be honest, maybe you like the word too. And I want to ask you a political question because we're in the political season. President Trump, talked about infrastructure, bigly 3.5 years ago. It's kind of come up again. President Obama, talked about it. My view, we didn't do enough during the TARP relief in this area, but I know that's a debatable point. But my point is, this issue has been hanging around a lot. But if you go break it down and you talk to Americans about it, it ranks a lot higher on their priority list of concerns than foreign policy. And I'm a foreign policy guy. I want that to be higher. What can we do? I mean, Jay Timmons just made this really key point. He says, we've just shown what we can do in COVID when that's a national priority up there. Infrastructure was a priority before. How, when COVID is dealt with and over, do we not lose sight of the significance of infrastructure? Do you have any insight to that, given the fact that you're running for office, you're running for re-election like in 5 days? How do you talk to people about infrastructure so that they maintain, that fire for it?
Well, in my own personal case, I talk to people about the investments that we've made at the federal level on major infrastructure projects. I go to my communities and I can point out the successes that we've had advocating with this administration for investments into our communities on rail projects, road projects, mass transit projects. They're all success stories to show my constituents and show the American people that in spite of the hyperpolarization that in this environment we live in, we are still doing good things when it comes to infrastructure investment. But you're right, Steve, we've got to do more. And the only way to do more is to get politics out of infrastructure once again. Unfortunately, that's what killed any long-term infrastructure bill that we could have passed to address our crumbling roads and bridges. And it also killed any, large infrastructure package coming from the administration just over the last 4 years. Nothing but politics.
Congressman, we're taking questions from the audience, and we've got a tough one for you from Claire. Claire?
Hi, my name's Claire August. I'm the Manager of Congressional Affairs at the Solar Energy Industries Association in Washington, D.C. Our electric grid has an opportunity to be cleaner, safer, and more resilient. I'd like to know, what investments in infrastructure would you like to see in the electricity sector so that American manufacturers, small businesses, and families can more easily take advantage of renewable energy?
Great question.
It's a great question, Claire. And I'm a supporter of an all-of-the-above approach. Wind and solar play an important role in America's already success in reducing our carbon footprint. But we all realize that we can't run the American economy on renewable energy sources alone. And we've got to continue to invest in baseload generating capacity. That means nuclear facilities. A lot of folks don't realize nuclear facilities like the one in my district in Clinton, Illinois, they have zero emissions. We need baseload generators that can continue to reduce our carbon footprint, but keep America economically competitive and alive on the world and global marketplace. And that's an issue that I think we all can agree on when it comes to an all-of-the-above approach. And I would love to be able to incentivize and continue to invest in all sources of energy with a plan to continue the successful reduction that America is leading the world in when it comes to carbon emissions.
Well, Congressman Rod Davis, I know my people were talking to you earlier, and I heard you had some questions for me, but I know we're out of time. So sorry we didn't hear from your dog as well, but Rod Davis, Congressman from Illinois, good. I know you've got a lot on your plate right now with the election around the corner, but thanks so much for cutting out some time for us, because I know this is a priority for you.
It really is, Steve, and it's great to be with you again. Great to see you, and can't wait to see you again in D.C. when we get back.
Take care, my friend. Thank you so much. And now it's time for the sponsor perspective portion of our program. Before we get going, a quick clarification. While I'm conducting this interview and the questions are mine, the content of this portion of the event shouldn't be considered editorial. With that, I'd like to welcome Lori Self. Lori is Senior Vice President and Counsel of Government Affairs with Qualcomm. Lori, it's great. I know you're in San Diego area, and the light is great there, and so we're very jealous. You are in San Diego, right?
I'm actually based in our DC office. I'm in my home in Northern
I'm so sorry
Virginia
for that.
right now.
Well, I was hoping you were in San Diego, where I visited Qualcomm many times. So goof there, but yeah, the weather sucks today in Washington. But anyway, Lori, let me ask you a question. You know, today, I mean, what I've been very committed to do is have a conversation, as I was trying to have with Congressman Davis, that looks at waterways, roads, transportation, bridges, and all of this, but it just feels so antiquated to me. And I want us to understand that broadband, 5G, the retrofitting, the sensors, the big data, and the connectivity that we're all also talking about has to be part of this conversation. Can you share with us how Qualcomm has made that conversation finally possible?
Yeah, so let me just, for those who don't know, Qualcomm, we are the world's leading developer of wireless cellular technology. So when we think about each generation of cellular technology, 2G, 3G, 4G, now the 5G era, it's our inventions that kind of underlie that systems-wide cellular architecture. And so, you know, the research and development that goes into these cellular communications platforms is incredible. And that's really been our role, to be that R&D engine for the 5G ecosystem, and also to anticipate what 5G needs to deliver in order to become that resilient, ubiquitous cellular infrastructure. And, you know, as you're talking about different kinds of physical infrastructures, I think what's apparent today more so than ever is that connectivity is the critical infrastructure for the 21st century, and cellular provides that robust connectivity. And of course, as we move further into the 5G era, we'll see cellular 5G technologies make existing physical infrastructures smarter, more efficient, more resilient, more secure. And of course, we'll also see an incredible revolution in different verticals that will be enabled by 5G, including automotive and factories of the future and so forth.
I mean, it's staggeringly large. And when you look at what the amount, I mean, when you talk about going from 4G to 5G, people don't understand it's not an increment, it's a strategic leap, right, in terms of what is going to get processed. So I think it's hard for many folks to get their head around it. But one of the other areas they can get their head around is the fact that so much connectivity is tough today, that we have, particularly in the United States, a divide between rural and urban areas. We have areas in urban cities that are not connected. Do you see a pathway that I mean, we have to learn a new lexicon, right? Millimeter wave and new technologies that are going to become part of this conversation that we need to help inject in our conversation. Are we going to be able to leapfrog, do you believe, over some of these structural inadequacies in our connectivity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, as we talk, you mentioned millimeter wave. That is one of those groundbreaking 5G technologies that we think will become that pathway to overcoming the connectivity divide in rural America and other underserved parts of our country. And we're already doing pilots using millimeter wave technologies in parts of rural America. And what we're finding is that, you know, these cellular technologies that can be efficiently deployed by local carriers with great productivity gains also bring incredible data rate speeds to rural communities. So really phenomenal increases in connectivity in parts of the country that have been underserved for many years now. And so we think of 5G as almost being the equivalent of what we saw in the early 20th century, where, you know, significant strides were made to bring electricity to parts of the country that were, you know, essentially living in a 19th century world. We're in kind of a similar place right now in the 21st century, where by bringing these cellular technologies to the country overall, we're really going to provide incredible access to technology in places that have been really, you know, missing out on those incredible advances. And of course, you know, COVID has brought all of that into the spotlight for so many parts of our country.
Well, look, Lori, we're going to go completely off script here because I want to share a little bit of my own relationship with Qualcomm. I mean, when, 30 years ago, when I was a young guy in Los Angeles, I met Erwin Jacobs, and he became a $500 a year corporate member of the Japan America Society. This was a time when, if you go back to the press, Nobody thought what Qualcomm would succeed. They thought it was going to be a company that didn't make it. Interesting idea near UCSD. But if you go to the Patent and Trademark Office and you look at the greatest innovators in the country, if you go to the museum at Qualcomm today and you see how you were part of CB radios and Motorola things and beepers and gadgets here and there, it's a story of innovation and risk. And I want to inject that in the conversation and ask you about 5G, because a lot of people think 5G just happened. The government said just happened. I know that's not true, but I think you can tell that story better than I can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you mentioned Dr. Jacobs. I mean, he is one of Qualcomm's founders, our first CEO, and really the visionary in understanding the potential for cellular communications when the company was founded in 1985. And really, he has kind of set the tone in the mission for the country throughout our history, really that focus on research and development, understanding the potential for cellular communications, understanding how it can be that transformative technology, but also willing to make those big, long horizon R&D investments. And so, I think it's important for the audience to understand that these investments are funded by the private sector. Qualcomm does not receive, significant government funding. We make those investments through our own revenues. And we're looking at technologies that, first of all, often are defying the law of physics, as one Stanford professor kind of iconically put it in the early days of Qualcomm, claiming that our technology was, essentially not possible. And we've defied those expectations throughout our history. And 5G was a very similar dynamic where we made the decision years ago that cellular communications could evolve to create a 5G architecture that was really about device-device communications, expanding available spectrum through millimeter wave technologies, creating an environment that could justify, very dense networks of devices communicating to other devices with new technologies that enabled ultra low latency, ultra high reliability, the kinds of requirements we think about in terms of mission critical services like connected cars and telehealth and so forth. And that vision, required a significant investment in R&D, recognizing that those technologies might never bear fruit, but even if they did prove to be successful, they would not reach the marketplace for years in the future. And of course, a big part of Qualcomm's job is convincing the rest of the industry and the rest of the mobile ecosystem that these technologies have incredible value. And again, I think we're living in a moment in time where that recognition of why 5G is such an essential connectivity fabric is really at the forefront of these conversations around infrastructure. So when we think about investments in infrastructure, we think there has to be that focus on cellular infrastructure in addition to all the other forms of infrastructure that we kind of think about in our daily lives.
Lori, just finally, whether Qualcomm wanted this or not, 5G has become one of the biggest high-stakes gambles geopolitically today. It's become a big gamble for cities as they begin thinking about which direction they're going. We know the U.S.-China spats that are going on are having consequence. But I also know that the R&D system that sits in the middle of all of this, I can't imagine that it's not fragile. I know you talk to policymakers all the time. Now we have a lot of members of the public watching today. What are the biggest parts of this puzzle that we should know about making that ecosystem in these times of turbulence and change less fragile?
Yeah, and it's such an important question. I think first of all, recognizing that as the United States, we have a system of laws and values, if you will, including intellectual property rights, including a commitment to a free market, including a commitment to enabling the private sector to harness the best ideas and harness creativity to fuel R&D. And that's an incredibly advantageous position to be in. But as you say, in order for those incentives to kind of do their job in terms of encouraging long horizon R&D investments, we have to make sure that those policy foundations are strong. So I spend a lot of my day talking about intellectual property, but of course, as you're suggesting, we're now at a moment in time where it's not just a matter of, do we have a strong intellectual property system? It's looking at the intersection between research and development and national security goals and trade policies and regulatory policies. So we need to make sure that that our innovators in this country have a framework of strong policies that encourage those ongoing investments in R&D. I think the good news is that the United States is leading in the foundational 5G R&D. We have had that leadership position for decades now, and we continue to have that leadership position. But as you suggest, we can't take that for granted. These new technologies like 5G, like AI, these are not inevitable advances. These are advances that take years of commitment to research and development, the best and brightest engineers in the world. Obviously, that workforce issue has its own set of policy imperatives. So understanding how these different policies interconnect to maintain that R&D leadership position, and also understanding the incredibly important benefits of that R&D leadership position, both from an economic perspective as well as from a national security perspective.
Well, Lori Self, Senior Vice President and Counsel of Government Affairs at Qualcomm, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today and for supporting today's program. And I'll look forward to getting out with you to the museum in San Diego, where we can both go together and enjoy a trip finally one of these days. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
From highways and streets, rail, freight, and aviation to newer multimodal options like scooters and car share apps, my next guests think a lot about how our transportation needs are changing on an almost daily basis. Robert Fuentes is the president and CEO of the Enos Center for Transportation, which provides research and analysis to policymakers and industry leaders. Harriet Tregoning is the director of the New Urban Mobility Alliance, a group that channels tech-based disruptions in urban transport. That means it's the cool stuff out there, the cool new stuff. Robert, let me just start with you for a moment, as I also know that you were in one of my other favorite places in town, the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, which is sort of the smart, best and promising practices and how cities and urban centers should run themselves. So can you give us a snapshot of what is, I don't know how to put it, what sucks in transportation infrastructure right now that we need to fix?
Yeah, the problem that we've had for a number of years is that we haven't done a really good job in maintaining the system that we already have in place. We did a really good job in this country over the last few generations building new stuff, but we have not done what we've had to do to upgrade, modernize, and just generally just do more upkeep on the existing system. So if there's one thing that we need to do over the next few years, it's making sure that we're repairing what's already in place.
Do you think,
at the same time,
we're going that direction?
We're outfitting it with all new tech. Yep, sorry.
Are we going that direction? Are we beginning to move that direction?
Some places are. There are some places that are being forced into it because of the fiscal conditions that they're finding themselves in, but it's a big country. It's also a very fast-growing country in a lot of ways. So there are certain parts of the country, the Intermountain West, for example, parts of the South, where they are still building a lot of new infrastructure to accommodate a lot of new growth. But we're accommodating it in the old traditional ways, which facilitates the need for more investments because we're spreading out further and further. And as we do that, we tend to neglect what's going on in existing places and in the dense urban core. So there's not one answer to the question about what's happening, but clearly we need to do a better job of maintaining what we've got overall.
Thank you for that, Harriet. One of the beefs I have with some of my media friends who report on scooters and ride sharing and bike share and ride hailing and all the new stuff is they think the millennials did it all. I tell them, I wanted this stuff too. That the kind of like putting it, giving the credit to the younger crowd may be wrong. But I'd love to get your sense, particularly, I live in D.C., so I've seen a lot of this come to the Washington area, and I know you've been responsible for a lot about it. How is it working out? Where are we on the curve, if you will, of moving to a much more nimble, much more clean and green transportation system that fits the habits and needs of our citizens in cities?
Well, I think
we just lost Harriet.
No, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, great.
I think what you're seeing in DC is an example of what other cities could also be doing, which is that, we have almost 40% of our households are carless. And that's in many cases by choice. That means that they're only spending about 9% of household income on transportation compared to the regional average, which is 19%. So it means that it's a level of affordability that makes households resilient. And I think that the proliferation of choices that we have here has made that really possible for people to say, either I can have one less car, or maybe I can go without a car at all. And I think that kind of change, which has happened over just a couple of decades here in the district, maybe less, is possible in lots of other cities.
Well, Harriet, how is it going, like, in terms of how I should call it? If I wish I had a measuring stick for the magnanimity of different traveling groups. At the beginning, when you had auto drivers, I remember the hostility the first times I was driving one of the shared bikes. Now it seems to have worked out. There's an equilibrium there that people seem to be able to live with. Now with scooters, it seems to intend. But do you think at all about how to get mutual understanding and respect between different transportation modalities?
So I think that the need for that respect is in part mitigated by infrastructure, the thing that Rob was talking about, that you would have the infrastructure for slower moving traffic, whether those are scooters or bikes or even pedestrians, not being in close proximity to fast moving cars. The other way to do it is to make the entire jurisdiction safer for everyone by slowing the speed of cars. And both of those things are being attempted in Washington right now. So I think that the growing ubiquity of these other options and the fact that even drivers use these other options some of the time has led to more understanding and more respect for the other users of the road.
Thank you for that. Robert, let me ask you a kind of similar question from a different angle. I've hung out interesting evenings unexpectedly with kind of futurist urban planners, who sort of talk about, how searching for parking places will end because of, total information and various dimensions of this, or looking at how transportation infrastructure, particularly in trains and transit, is going to change so much. I'm interested in what the biggest blind spots are when it comes to urban mobility questions that policymakers make and don't see. I'm just wondering, you've been through this so many different times. What are the typical mistakes in perspective or planning that would help smarten us up?
I think part of the problem is that we don't take a holistic look at transportation. We tend to treat transportation in its silo, and we don't make transportation decisions for what transportation is designed to do, right? We're not just driving around or walking around or scootering around for the fun of it. Well, maybe scootering sometimes, but we are trying to do something. You're trying to accomplish some kind of goal or get to some place. So when we think about transportation in isolation, we get transportation-related outcomes. That's fine. But what we need to do is do the things that Harry was talking about. And how do you make this more a part about how we build our communities? How do we make this more a part about our efforts to reduce carbon and affect climate change? How do we make transportation part of our desire to increase access, particularly for low-income neighborhoods and racial justice and things like that? Once you take transportation out of its box and connect it to all those things that we know it's designed to do, you exponentially increase its effectiveness. And so that's one thing I think we don't do very well. The other is that we also rely on the federal government to do an awful lot of this, which there's clearly a federal role in all kinds of areas of infrastructure, particularly transportation. But when we talk about, as you had before, about a $2 trillion infrastructure bill, people think, well, that's so big that only the federal government is the one who can be working on that. But the reality is the cities and the states particularly have an enormous role to play in all of this. So the federal government can do an awful lot to help spur the innovation that gets to the things you were talking about. Break down silos, encourage innovation, learn from best practices, pilots. There's a huge demand right now for places to learn from one another, and the federal government can have a really big role to play in that.
Steve,
Harriet,
can I jump in
yeah,
on
please,
that
please.
question? And with Rob. I think that how the federal government gives out that money makes all the difference in terms of what kind of outcomes you give. So just putting it out as a formula grant and saying spend it however you want at this moment in time is going to be a huge mistake. Rob mentioned access. Most parts of the country, most states, the thing that the transportation system is designed to do is to reduce congestion, not to provide people access. So that would be a fundamental watershed change to make access the number one thing that transportation is intended, is supposed to accomplish, and measure it against that.
Well, Harriet, I want to give you credit for retweeting a tweet that I love and get your both comments on it. You retweeted out, it was the end of September, but it was still relevant. You say 2.8 million essential workers rely on transit every day. A new COVID relief bill is being drafted that includes funding for airlines, but not transit. Does your nurse fly to work? Call your representatives. It's a very interesting comment about the times we're in, and I got to tell you, there's a lot of money going to planes and airlines and all that. But when I look at, buses, the metro, these sorts of issues, and with all due respect to this wonderful city, I wonder, are we safe enough with our health guardrails? Do we have the systems and ventilation systems? Let me just ask you both, what do we need to up our game on when it comes to thinking about this time, public health, and still moving people? Harriet and Robert?
Well, transit is certainly a lot safer than the initial reports seem to indicate. That the CDC suggested, among others, that the high rates of COVID in New York were all about transit, when in fact, globally, there's not really been any a significant transmission associated with transit systems. And in fact, the air replacement for transit is much higher than in an office building or an apartment building, for example, in a restaurant. So I think we scared people off of transit needlessly. And those transit systems need riders. People need to get to places. So I think part of what every transit system needs to do, and if we had leadership in the federal government, what would also need to happen is a consistent message about wear a mask, but it's safe to ride transit.
Thank you. Robert, your thoughts on this moment? I mean, part of the reason I think, I keep wondering, whenever you have a massive national crisis, it gives you permission to spend. What Harriet just said is, let's not do that by silly formulas. Let's get the guardrails right. But I'm just wondering, at this moment of a health crisis, can we do something with the social contract? Can we do something smarter than we're doing in the name of this crisis that leaves us better off at the end? Your quick thoughts?
Sure. I think we certainly do need to take care of aviation and our aviation sector. And I think there has been movement that way, and for lots of good reasons that needs some attention. But when it comes to public transit, we do need to think a little bit differently, because transit is one thing. But when we often say that, I think we're thinking about subway systems. We're thinking about the metro here. We think about the MTA in New York, the ones that are very visible and make for really good shots when the news is down there talking about what's happening in stations and things like that. But transit is very different. And, the folks who are riding heavy rail systems, the subways, have a very different demographic profile than folks who are taking the bus, for example. So where you started with this for essential workers, we know that bus ridership has declined, certainly, but not nearly to the extent as commuter-style transit services have, because we know that the bus is really the backbone of transportation access for many communities, particularly for low-income communities, particularly for essential workers. So you may have seen drops of in the 40-50% range for bus, which is pretty significant, but nothing like commuter rail, for example. Long Island Railroad, 97% drops. Metro here, 85-90% drops. So when we think about transit and we think about its role in the recovery, we've got to think about who it's designed to serve, how they need the system, and then what we can do pretty cheaply, actually. Harry and I were talking about some of the bus innovations that are happening in cities all across this country right now, and even was going on before the pandemic here in the Washington region. Just painting red lines on 8th Street has done enormous work to move buses faster, to make them function better as part of the overall transportation system, we should keep doing lots more of that all across the country, and I think we will.
Well, thank you. Well, we have a question from the audience for you both from Bernie. Bernie?
Hi, I'm Bernie Brill, Executive Director of the Sheet Metal and Air Conditioning Contractors National Association's Mid-Atlantic Chapter. And my question for you today is dealing with COVID-19. With the spike in numbers we're seeing in hospitalizations and test scores, is there any sort of acceptance or awareness of what we can expect to see happen in terms of air purification systems in college dormitories, apartment buildings, office buildings, hospitals, that sort of thing in the future? Will we see a demand for air purification systems? Thank you.
So thank you, Bernie. So that's a little outside the transport area, but I'm interested in, as you have a purview of this, and Harry, you kind of addressed part of it with regard to a misunderstanding of what may be the reality in certain transit systems. But how do you look at this need now potentially for more air purification systems? Harriet?
I don't even know if it's necessarily purification. I think one of the issues is the circulation. So how is fresh air replaced so that with long occupancy in a given enclosed space, concentrations of the virus can build up? This virus or any airborne illness. So I think that when I was the planning director in DC, we did a lot of work on energy efficient buildings, and a lot of that work was about actually, not doing as much circulation, not doing as much replacement because of the implications for energy efficiency. So I think there will be some changes with respect to this, and I think that that's something to be thinking about and looking for inexpensive ways to be able to do that. We built a lot of buildings with no operable windows, which is one of the cheapest and easiest ways to get fresh air into a building is to open a window. So yeah, I think going forward, this will be a consideration in the planning, design, and construction of buildings.
Robert?
Well, as it relates to transportation, I think it's the point that Harriet brought up earlier, that we need to do a much better job at talking about how effective these cleaning systems are in both for public transit and in aviation. There are studies. There's all kinds of different examples showing that the concern that was expressed early on in the pandemic really doesn't manifest itself in reality in many of these places. So the transit agencies are doing an excellent job in cleaning. Aviation sector is doing an excellent job in cleaning. We need to do a much better job of getting those messages out there.
Well, I want to thank you both for sharing your thoughts on this. Robert Quinzes, who's President and CEO of the Enos Center for Transportation. Harriet Tregoning is Director of the New Urban Mobility Alliance, has transformed Washington, D.C. in ways I really like. I want to thank you both for joining us today. I hope you'll come back.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Perhaps more than ever before, the pandemic has highlighted the importance of a robust digital infrastructure. Our next guest will help us understand what the government and private sector need to do to make sure our national digital infrastructure grows to meet our needs and ambitions. Doug Brake is the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He also serves on the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Group. That means he's powerful. Catherine Benjamin is the Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Digital Services for New York City. Very cool job. And Susie Armstrong is the SVP of Engineering at Qualcomm, one of the sponsors of today's event. She's a pioneer in bringing internet protocols to the cellular industry, resulting in the first web surfing on a cell phone. You guys all have no idea how much you owe Susie Armstrong for your distractions. Hey, it's great to be with all of you. Let's have the view on digital internet. Let me ask you, you're all digital people, and I'm wondering if we're making a mistake today in the way we've structured today's program. I talked to Congressman Rod Davis earlier, and I said, hey, when we're thinking about infrastructure, roads, waterways, air, are we missing broadband? Aren't we missing the 5D digital? And shouldn't we sort of de-silo this? Should I have, Susie on with a road guy? Should I have, Doug on with someone who can talk about, with our friend Harriet, who's rewired the way Washington thinks about this stuff? So I apologize if I've created a silo here, but let me just start off with you, Doug, and ask, are we at a point yet where, as we talk about infrastructure, things like broadband, like 5G, like data, like digital, like Internet of Things, are becoming seen as part of a legitimate part of the conversation when we think about all these other elements of infrastructure?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's increasingly obvious the broadband connectivity and wireless connectivity as well is just critical to be incorporated into infrastructure policy at large, right? Of course, broadband highlighted during the pandemic as an incredibly important tool to connect people for education, for work during this difficult period of staying at home and this pseudo quarantine that we're under. So critical that we have robust broadband networks. But as we look towards opportunities, potential for a large infrastructure package to incorporate, sensors, connectivity, ways to measure and improve the resilience and efficiency of all of our infrastructure built for the 21st century is incredibly important. So I think important to focus on broadband, and totally fair to section us off, but absolutely, as we look to the future and real opportunities around a large spending package focused on infrastructure, incredibly important that digital concerns are incorporated throughout the entire thinking in that process.
That's great, Catherine. When COVID hit, it hit before, but when we all first began taking it seriously, like in March, my weekly trips on Amtrak to New York ceased, and my daily trips to New York via Zoom sort of quintupled. And so we're writing one system less, writing another system more. And I'm interested with you as the CTO, Deputy CTO of New York City, what has that meant inside the bowels of one of the biggest city governments in America, the biggest city government in America? I mean, how has it changed your relationship with citizens, expectations, businesses, services, and are they paying you more because you become more important?
Well, the mission of the Mayor's Office of the CTO is to ensure that technology is inclusive and accessible and provides opportunity for all New Yorkers. And so in the context of COVID-19, what we're seeing is that the need for simple, seamless, and intuitive digital services has never been more important. Because as you say, we have a situation where for many New Yorkers, the way in which they engage with the world, including government, is now primarily through online or digital interfaces. So to Doug's point a moment ago, you can actually think of this as sort of a level of tiers. So in order for people to benefit from any digital service, they do need to have access to high quality and affordable broadband. So that's a huge focus for our office and a huge pillar of our work. In addition to that, though, I think it's important to talk about digital inclusion. So providing the internet, but also making sure that people know how to make use of it and use it in ways that respect their digital rights is really important. So that's also a focus for our office. And assuming you have both of those things in place, then that's where the digital services come in. And so what we're doing at the Mayor's Office of the CTO is bringing in these sort of culture, processes, and practices of the internet era, the ways of working that you would see inside, a tech startup, and bringing that into government. And I think it's worth noting that it's not just the CTO in New York who's doing this. The digital government movement has been alive and thriving for many, many years. But not unlike things like telehealth providers, something like COVID-19 has now shone a spotlight on the work that's been going on in some of these exemplars around the world.
So part of what you describe, Katie, is and I may be getting it wrong, so excuse me, but a sort of software world. But it has to ride in a hardware set of platforms. Is New York City becoming a 5G city?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we're doing is trying to build with the communities rather than for the communities when it comes to 5G. So one of the most important things when we talk about 5G is making sure that firstly, it's safe for the millions of people who walk through the streets of New York, both residents and tourists every year. But we're also kind of upping the expectation of what infrastructure should look like. So the Mayor's Office of the CTO is soon to be releasing the 5G Design Challenge, where we're inviting designers and architects and engineers to submit their ideas of what it should look like and how we can leverage city assets to bring in the equipment necessary to bring in next generation connectivity in New York.
Thank you for that. Susie, you're our 5G visionary here, and I have to admit, and I know that Doug is also into this in a big way, and I sort of feel, and this is my own editorial view, 5G is a really lousy name. I'd love to talk to the marketers. The lousy name for describing people, either they're so into the topic or they're so kind of like, what, But I think when it comes to the question of having a vision of what could be transformed in our lives, in our cities, in our country, in the interactivity of everything. Can you give a snapshot? I know you're an engineer and not a marketer, but can you give a snapshot of what the transformative potential of 5G is?
Sure. I think the pandemic, if anything, has made us happy, if you will, that this did not happen 10 years ago. I think the networks actually survived reasonably well. But what it's also shown us, it's really hit the accelerator on the need for things like 5G, millimeter wave, that kind of speed and that kind of response time that not only connects people via their phones and their laptops and Zoom calls, but connects infrastructure, if you will. And one of the things that we're really excited about, and I'm really excited about, I would love to be on a panel with the transportation guys, because, while the pandemic has really cut down on the commute traffic here in San Diego, we do a lot more things in our cars. And there's hundreds of kids who have discovered e-bikes who are, riding around or for all good reasons on the streets outside. And when you drive around San Diego in the residential areas, you really want those smart intersections, those intersections that talk to your car. The poles talk to your car so you can see, what kid or what ball is running out into the street. And so I think that's, for me, the real excitement of 5G. I think it's wonderful, that your videos will come down faster, et cetera. But the real excitement of 5G is how it's going to pull us out of this pandemic from a infrastructure and an economic sense. Connected transportation, connected healthcare. Every parent on planet is all my colleagues are living the reality of home and distance learning. And while it's wonderful that most kids, not all kids, can get connected at home, I think you have things like 5G and millimeter wave that bring forth the opportunities to do augmented reality to help in learning. So these are the kinds of 5G is not just, infrastructure for connectivity. I think 5G is really significant for, as I said before, pulling us out of the pandemic economically and really making what we think of as traditional infrastructure industries, transportation and factories and such, much more resilient and better, if you will.
Susan, can I ask you a question as an engineer, and then I want to ask this of Doug too, because Doug is also, like me, a junkie for geopolitical, defense stuff. But I'm just interested, when engineers like you see the fact that you developed algorithms so that people could send photos or surf the web or find these things, or the 5G infrastructures we just heard from Lori Self was a bet that a private company was making about the future, put substantial dollars at risk. It's a public company, rises and falls on these issues. Is there a resentment among engineers that do this, that they can fall into the world of becoming, a geopolitical pawn, and then see challenges emerge where you've got one of the most successful technologies that defines the future for many, many states, and yet you matter so much that governments are now arguing, I think, kind of carelessly and recklessly about you. But I'm just interested in how the engineering world sees it. Is that a fair question?
That's a really interesting question. And no, I don't know of, as engineers, we get really excited about this stuff, and we get really excited about not only those transportation applications that we can see, but we get excited about the uses that we can't see, the uses that the kids going into STEM are going to bring up in 5 years. Of course, we'll probably be on to 6G in 10 years. So I don't see that resentment. I do see concern. Especially as we are in a very sort of, I do bring the engineering focus at Qualcomm to the policy work. And I and other engineers are very concerned that, without the right policies in place, number one, some of these technologies don't see the light of day, but we're also very concerned about anything, and we've seen a lot of moves, anything that damps the a private company's ability to do R&D, universities to be able to do their research, because you don't have any 5G or anything else to deploy unless you have that upfront research. And that's something I'm also very involved in, as you know, Steve, in our STEM work. And I get very concerned when I see education and research and R&D under attack, if you will, because you need that upfront research and you need jobs for those STEM kids. And, you need that to make America, maintain its leadership in these areas. So, for example, the decoupling with China conversations, if we want to get political, are of great concern to engineers who have, generally engineers, they work across the ocean, they work across national boundaries. And so I think to the engineering community, it's like with the academic community, we're quite concerned about these kinds of bifurcations in the work and the long-term R&D that we do.
I want to mention before I jump to Doug real quick that I'm very impressed with what you have done with this program called Think a Bit, which is to bring young women, communities of color into science at a really early age. So let's use the opportunity to say it's Think a Bit, right? Am I got it right?
Think a Bit Lab, and it went
Think
virtual.
a Bit Lab. Okay, well,
I think
got part of it.
Post videos on our website, and if you want an upper, you watch those videos. You will think there is hope for the world.
And I'm lucky enough that I met one of those video people in real life, so it was really fun. Doug, let me ask you a question on the other side of this, if you'd like to go that direction, which is you've written a little bit about your concern about the discussion of nationalizing 5G. And again, through the infrastructure scaffolding lens, what are the trade-offs and hard choices that you think exist out there when you hear about what the Pentagon wants to do, when you hear about nationalizing 5G network per se? Do warning bells go off, or do you think that's something we should just hug really tightly and say, cool?
I think fair to say warning bells go off, right? I mean, to your original question, right, when you're talking about some of the geopolitical implications of 5G and the sort of race to 5G and competitiveness, especially vis-a-vis China, I do think that it's worth kind of stepping back and recognizing, don't get me wrong, 5G, incredibly important, transformative potential. But I do worry sometimes that the hype cycle, the hype around 5G has gotten so great that some within the administration, 5G has started to take on as a sort of stand-in for our technological prowess as a country overall, and has led to some, I think, really sort of panicky and poorly thought through policy proposals. I think this proposal around potential nationalization or a wholesale network falls into that group. Also, some of the efforts around export controls to stop any sales of U.S. technology to Chinese companies really aren't going to be very effective in the long term in curbing competition, and really only shoot U.S. technology providers in the foot. So I think we need a much more long-term, much more strategic vision for how we compete on 5G. It's a whole can of worms, and so I don't know if we need to get into all of it right now, but absolutely, it's a very important question.
Doug, I have to say that you're just such a nice guy waving warning signs. It's like danger, Will Robinson, danger, Will, but you're so calm and smiling about it. So, but I get a sense that you think it's some serious issues. Katie, and just as we're in the last stretch here, just real quickly, and I want to get any of your thoughts on this, but knowing your background, reading your background, from working in healthcare and hearing you about digital rights and whatever, I think I look at human capital as part of the infrastructure equation of America, as Susie was just speaking to, and digital rights and how you do this. We're at a time right now, whether because of a health crisis, and no matter what the growth rate was announced today, which was like 33%, there's a huge economic crisis that remains out there. There's a racial tension crisis in America. And one of the things that haunts me, which I mentioned early in our program today, was an interview I did years ago with Anthony Fox, who was the former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, and said, Steve, we made investment decisions in roads and bridges and infrastructure that cut off communities. And guess what? Those communities were divided by race. Are there opportunities in what you're doing and how you're looking at broadband and 5G to leapfrog out of that mess that we created, those biases and bigotry in the past, and create true inclusion in ways that we were unable to? Or am I naive? Will all of this continue? Will the digital divide continue to prevail? I mean, I look at the fact that I'm just wondering, do we have a big opportunity here to get things right that we got wrong before?
Yeah, we absolutely have a huge opportunity. So when you look at the areas of New York that have less strong or fewer options in terms of broadband connectivity, you won't be surprised to learn that they are areas that historically have been overlooked by big business. And when you look at the demographic profile of those areas, it's often areas that are predominantly African American or Latino. So part of what the city of New York is doing is trying to address that through a soon to be released request for proposals, which is part of our $157 million capital investment in broadband infrastructure to work towards our universal broadband agenda. And so a huge component of this is addressing those areas where digital redlining has occurred and trying to find ways to get a diversity of respondents to that RFP to come in with fresh ideas and lower cost service options to help address those areas where there's less good connectivity in the city of New York. And then I think more broadly, from the perspective of digital services, it does seem a bit pedantic, but when you talk about why user-centered design is so critical in digital service design, it's because what you're literally doing is taking the insights from interviews with everyday people and having that inform your product development cycle. And if those interviews and the people you're speaking to don't reflect the diversity of your residents or the people in that region, then you won't be surprised to discover that those products may or may not resonate with the needs of those people. So certainly there's a huge opportunity, and I'm really pleased with the way in which New York is approaching that, because I think we have an opportunity to do a tremendous amount of good.
Susie, I'm going to give you a quick thing. Doug, if you want to say anything, because Susie, I know that you're obsessed with this issue as well. So any last thoughts?
I wrote that down on RFP. I'm thinking, how does Susie from Qualcomm answer that RFP? We are not carriers. But I think what you said is really, really important. There's a lot of very good focus on bringing high-speed broadband to rural areas for precision agriculture, for underserved, underrepresented areas. But I think there is at least an equal issue in bringing these kinds of opportunities to underrepresented populations, in urban areas, the sort of the socioeconomic gap, if you will. So I cannot agree with you more. And I think that, again, the pandemic has really showed us not only that there are geographical areas of the country that don't have good connectivity, but also that there are entire populations of students and people often of color who don't have enough connectivity to even take distance learning or work from home at home. And that's something that I think, we are trying to do our part as a company. But I also think that it requires the kind of focus that programs like this bring to it.
Thank you. Doug, final thoughts?
Sure, Steve, if I can real quickly, I do think it's important to kind of take a step back, right, and recognize the great success that our broadband networks in the U.S. had in making it through this pandemic and the great shift of work from home. We set out in a recent report on the lessons from the pandemic to look at essentially what's been a really fascinating natural experiment. I mean, sad circumstances and really unfortunate, but we did see a 20 to 40% big jump in internet traffic with around March with the stay-at-home orders, and in networks in the U.S. we saw performance degradation on average about 1%, not really noticeable. And so compared to some European nations that have a much more sort of utility style model, they had much more trouble and had to scale back some of the traffic on the networks. And so I think big picture, right, it indicates that our overall model facilities-based competition of large companies competing to build out networks is working pretty darn well in the U.S. At the same time, obviously, pandemic exposed the real gaps of digital divide, those rural areas that don't have infrastructure, the parts of the country that see real challenges around affordability. Right? We need all Americans, low income or not, to be able to afford broadband, and so we need real policy change to be able to ensure that everyone has access to broadband. And also, I think also expose, just really quickly, the need for critical services to be able to function online in a time like this. Telehealth, education are real obvious examples that come to mind. So big picture, I mean, things are working pretty well, all things considered, but also recognize that there are important gaps that still need to be filled in where our competitive model just doesn't work well to address.
Sure. Well, I'm about to talk to Representative Sam Graves, who's the ranking member of House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and I'm going to force him to talk about broadband too, in addition to barges on the Missouri. So thank you all so much. Doug Brake, Director of the Broadband and Spectrum Policy Program at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Catherine Benjamin, Deputy CTO for Digital Services in New York City, and Susie Armstrong, my favorite engineer, who's Senior Vice President Engineering at Qualcomm. Thank you to all three of you for a great conversation. I hope you'll come back because this is cool stuff. It's the stuff I like to do. So thank you all very much.
Always an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
According to my next guest, Republicans are ready to restart an infrastructure initiative in 2021. Congressman Sam Graves, a Republican from Missouri and the ranking member on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, joins me now. Congressman Graves, so happy to see you. I know this is a crazy week to get time on your schedule, but I know this is a priority topic. So let me ask you.
It is a priority topic.
Let me ask you a friendly question. I've been concerned about America's infrastructure, I feel like half my life. How do we get to a point where we've got so much infrastructure and new and rebuilt infrastructure, air, transport, rail, water, that we get sick of talking about it? We've got so much of it.
I don't know if we can ever get sick of talking about it, just simply because we have to maintain what we already have, and we're still a long ways away from that point. Infrastructure is something that the government should do and should do well, whether that's maintaining and building our roads and bridges, or maintaining pipeline, a very robust pipeline structure, inland waterways, aviation, rail, you name it. And those are the traditional infrastructure items that most people think about when we talk about infrastructure in general, is the transportation of goods and services, of people across the country.
What do you think are some of the biggest priorities? I've seen you out there tweeting recently about water infrastructure, about concern about flooding in northern Missouri and how to keep barges moving, of course roads, but also airports. If you were to prioritize, let's say, some of the three biggest items that America ought to be prioritizing in 2021, what would they be?
Well, to be honest with you, they're all important, but we put priorities based on when those reauthorizations come up, and the reauthorizations come up all the time. We obviously had highway or the surface transportation reauthorization that we were not able to get finished this year. September 30th was the deadline, so we've extended that a year. So that's a high priority. We also have WRDA, which is a water resources bill, and basically directs or reauthorizes the programs for all of our inland waterways. That's due now, as long as we stay on track for an every two year process. And so that's something that, that we've made those priorities right now. We obviously, right now in the middle of this pandemic, and we've got an aviation crisis going on too. So that has to be a priority. And we need to reauthorize the Paycheck Protection Program for the airlines, because, the last thing we want to see is that industry collapse. And this is due not to, bad business decisions. This is due to something that the government has done, and is creating real problems within the within aviation, at least when it comes to passenger carrying.
As you talk to your friends in the Senate on the Republican side of the aisle, are they with you on the Paycheck Protection Program? Are they with you in terms of understanding that there's another robust piece that needs to be, passed for, American business and American workers right now?
Well, yes and no. So what we have is a situation where, on something that Chairman DeFazio and myself, we put out, and something we wanted to see done is a standalone bill when it came to aviation. Unfortunately, we're seeing that added to the larger COVID or CARES Act extension or new bill that is being put out. It's being used kind of as a carrot to get a few more votes. But this is something that can't wait. It's something that can't wait for these negotiations. We've already worked out a good bill, or a good extension of the bill for the airlines, and we need to get it done. We need to get it done right away. But unfortunately, politics are playing a role in that process, and so it's kind of hung up in these negotiations when it comes to the overall COVID relief or pandemic relief. So it needs to happen. It needs to happen right away before we lose that. So all of those are priorities, but they're different. They're obviously different priorities.
I spoke recently to former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, who has this proposal out for an energy jobs coalition. He says, regardless of what you think about fossil energy or whatever, you got to have a mix out there. But we also have economic implosion for many Americans. And so if we can connect jobs and workers to key infrastructure that the nation may need, like, whether it's energy grid or other parts of that. And I'm just wondering, in the infrastructure area, is this another way that you can attach it to an economic revitalization program in 2021 that kind of addresses the fact that we've had, such a big hit to the economy?
Well, anytime you have an infrastructure bill, it's going to have impact when it comes to revitalization of the economy, because it is jobs and it is a government function. I mentioned earlier that infrastructure is something the government should do and should do well. And so anytime that we are putting money as whether that's a federal government or state government or even local government, those are good. Those are infrastructure dollars that are going to lead to jobs and are going to lead to economic fulfillment. And you got to remember something. In my thought process, transportation is pure commerce. Everything moves. People, goods, services, everything has to move by one transportation mode or another. In most cases, multiple transportation modes. So this is always good for the economy. It doesn't mean that we should spend frivolously, because we have to be very careful when it comes to spending those infrastructure dollars and make sure that they go as far as we can get them to go and be efficient about it. But it is a government function and something that's vitally important and does help the economy.
One of the things, Congressman, that comes up a lot when you talk about infrastructure is paying for it and how we budget it. And I know this is a perennial topic you're probably sick of, but should we consider something like capital budgeting programs rather than pay-go, trying to find offsets for every big infrastructure program? Or, I know there are also trust funds out there that are under stress as well, because the revenue sources for those trust funds aren't as robust as they might be. So is there another path that we ought to be considering on paying for long-term infrastructure, because it creates recurring returns for the economy that we're not thinking about now?
One thing in transportation is we have true trust funds, and there's still true trust funds. So all of those fuel tax dollars that are paid, they go into the highway trust fund, which pays for those projects. We have an aviation trust fund, which fuel tax dollars go into that. We have inland waterways trust fund. We have harbor maintenance trust fund. So these are true trust funds, and they need to be robust, and they need to be able to meet the needs. And that's one of the problems. You take the highway trust fund, for instance. We have more and more fuel-efficient cars on the road, which means they're buying less and less gas. We also have more and more vehicles on the road that simply don't buy gas. And so when you have a highway trust fund that is specifically funded through gas tax or fuel tax dollars, you have an entire portion of the public out there that isn't paying for any use of those highways or those bridges, which is one of the reasons why it's vitally important that we shift the dependence from fuel tax to something else. I've always proposed vehicle miles traveled because I think that's the most efficient way to do it. And this isn't, I don't want to pile another tax on top of what we already have. What I want to do is completely replace, just eliminate the fuel tax altogether and go with the vehicle miles traveled, which we could implement almost immediately and pick up all of those other fuel sources that they simply aren't paying for the use of the road right now. But we have to keep up with the demand when it comes to maintenance of these vital infrastructure arteries, and that's getting more and more expensive all the time. And we haven't had an increase since the 90s for instance, in surface transportation.
Let me ask you one final question. Some years ago, I was dropping in on Brad Smith. He's the CEO, or the president, I should say, not CEO, but president of Microsoft Corporation. And that weekend morning, they were opening something called the Evergreen Point Bridge, which is the longest floating bridge in America. It's on pontoons. It's pretty cool. Yeah. And I went there, kind of ran around it. It was kind of a nifty thing. It's salmon friendly and all that. But it took $8 billion and 15 years to do it. Was the second or third largest infrastructure project in America for a long time. I had just returned from China, where I sort of felt like they were developing one of those every 2 weeks. So I guess my crazy question to you is there something wrong with a bridge that you need between Bellevue and Seattle taking 15 years to build? Why does this stuff take so long? Is it money? Is it regulation? Because when you compare what's going on elsewhere in the world, it just seems like we're in slow motion.
It's regulation is what it is, and the amount of hoops that have to be jumped through to do a lot of these infrastructure projects. And you never see them happen on time or under budget. That's something that the president has been pushing for some time now when it comes to to highway projects, aviation projects, which I've got a bill that does just that, and it tries to incentivize early completion of these projects. But it's the regulation and these hoops that you have to jump through and the studies that have to be conducted to be able to get something done. And the longer something takes, the more money it's going to take. The more you draw it out, that's with any project. I don't care if you're building a building or a house or a new highway. The longer it takes, the more money it's going to take to get that completed, and that's a real problem. We waste so much money in this country on just it's just delay when it comes to projects, and we just study them to death and engineer them to death for that matter as well. And when it does not have to be that way. And that a lot of that has to do with government, and government needs to streamline that process. Something we've been pushing for a long time is to eliminate so much of the burdensome regulations that it takes to do these projects, and they would be so much cheaper for the taxpayer in the long run.
Well, Representative Sam Graves, Missouri, I know you got a busy week, but thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us on America's infrastructure needs today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of our program today. A big thank you to Qualcomm and to Maxar for their support, and to all of you in the audience for joining us. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we'll have our video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Think about infrastructure. Be well.